Okay, fellow classmates, so in this brief Unit 4 discussion, I'll talk about the thin versus thick client approach for software architecture. So first, let's go ahead and define what thin versus thick computing is. So thin computing, we would say it's a multi-tier client-server paradigm. The client typically runs programs from his or her PC, tablet, whatever it is, but the execution of the code actually occurs on a centralized server. Thick computing, on the other hand, is sometimes called fat client computing, but generally it's a similar concept in that the user still uses their PC to run programs and do things. However, most of the actual crunching, if you will, is done on a server. So in the definition there we say it's a multi-tier client-server paradigm where the programs utilized by the end user are run on the client's PC, and those programs that drive the relational database resides on a single server. So they're similar in some aspects, but certainly very different in others. And when we talk about thin and thick computing, there's McKenna's 4 laws, and I think they're worth mentioning, so I'm going to go ahead and mention them here. If we had identical applications, the first law says that if we moved from a thick to a thin computing architecture, it does not reduce the computing resources that we need. All it does is just shift the resources from the computer, the personal computer, over to the server. Rule number 2 there, or law number 2, says moving from a thick to a thin does not reduce the need for bandwidth. Instead, it just shifts the bandwidth from the local area network to the company intranet. Rule number 3, both models require the same processing power to service the users within the organization, however many that is. It just depends where that processing power resides. Is it more on the PC or is it more on the server? And then law number 4 says moving from thick to thin does not necessarily reduce costs. You still have costs associated with both. And perhaps over the long run, some argue that moving to a thin might save money in the long run. But nonetheless, generally, that's McKenna's 4 laws. And so on the next chart, I want to compare a little bit more detail some of the differences between the thin versus the thick. So in terms of processing speed, if we're adding users to the thick environment, the client PCs absorb most of that workload, because with the thick environment, of course, the processing is generally done for the most part on the client's PCs. If we add users to a thin environment, by contrast, if we don't upgrade the server, if we have the same server for all intents and purposes, it's going to get bogged down the more users you add to it. For processing power, the thick environment is what we would kind of call a decentralized environment. The thin environment would be more centralized, if you will. For the thick environment in regards to the server, we don't generally need as sophisticated of a server because most of the processing is done actually on the client's PCs. However, with the thin environment, by contrast, because it's more complex, typically we require a much greater and more sophisticated server. And then I think one of the important differences refers to connectivity. For the thick environment, yes, we do need to be connected to that server, but we can do a lot of work offline on our PCs since they're doing most of the processing anyways. However, with the thin environment, it really requires, for the most part, relatively constant connectivity. And so, of course, if there's an issue with the internet or something's down and you can't connect, so to speak, to the server, it might be hard to kind of do your job. And so that's definitely a big pitfall of the thin. So which of these two do organizations prefer? probably might come as no surprise that over time a lot of organizations are shifting more to the thin client environment. There's the perceived reduced need for bandwidth, less maintenance costs in terms of the actual PCs themselves. Upgrading the PCs and stuff isn't as important because a lot of the processing is done on the server. And some of the other reasons: more control, better response times, hardware and software applications can be better utilized, as well as performing updates is a little bit easier. And then in the long run, there's that argument that there could be money savings from the actual thin environment. And so here I present to you a brief comparison between the two. Personally, I would argue, in the world in which we live today, I think going towards the thin environment is probably the better choice, although I certainly think one can make a case for both. That is my personal opinion, and I'll let you guys debate me in the discussion if you would like to. But that concludes my presentation. So thank you for listening.